Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin today with State Senator Dan McCay. He sponsored the bill to put Amendment G on the ballot. Senator, thanks for being here with us. We appreciate it.
Good to see you again.
Let's go back. We'll get into some of the numbers and where we move from now in just a bit. But let's go back and set this up. How did we get to the point where you were sponsoring a bill to put Amendment G on the ballot?
Well, I'm a state senator, and you have to be a state senator to sponsor a bill. Do you want
We
to
don't
go
need
back that far?
No, we don't need like the Bill 101 kind of stuff.
Okay, good. I knew you didn't. So, you know, what you have seen from the legislature over the last, probably I'd say the last 5 years, is a public education effort where we have actively been trying to figure out how do we deal with a exponential growth in income tax, because we've had a positive growth in new jobs and things like that in the state of Utah. And yet our other funds that are used to, and then all that education, all that money from income tax goes into education only. And then all of our funds that are used to pay for the rest of the state budget were lagging behind. And so, you know, how do you continue to deal with that budget imbalance? And there were lots of ways to deal with it. We looked at, you know, we saw at the very beginning of 2019, we passed a major tax reform. And the voters, you know, a lot of people didn't like it. And so they put together a referendum on the legislature, which is very uncommon. The last one was the voucher bill. And that really kind of put things in motion for Amendment G. I ran it during the 2019 session at the same time that we were looking at the earlier versions of tax reform.
Right.
And everybody thought, well, that's one way to do it, but we'd rather go this other route. And after that failed, everybody came back and said, well, maybe Amendment G idea would be the way to go, and that's how we got there.
This is always a big topic here in the state of Utah. It can be heated at times as well. A lot of people think that we're not putting enough money into the education system. There was a group that came together to the compromise table, if you will, surrounding Amendment G. Talk about who all was involved in that.
Well, you have every major education you know, interest that was really working with the state. And this is really, I mean, while I was the sponsor of the Amendment G platform, you really had a lot of leadership come out of Senator Ann Milner up in Ogden, a lot of leadership come out of the House with Representative Mike Schultz, and truly their efforts to meet with everybody and try to find ways to build a bridge and accomplish some major things that education community was really looking for. And
so real quick though, Senator, you mentioned lawmakers that were involved, but talk about those in the education field.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so you have the Utah Education Association, you have Education First, you have the PTA. I mean, those three major groups alone, getting them to the table and really trying to figure out what they needed from the future of the budget so that they felt secure enough to support changes to Amendment G. And that's why I say hats off to legislative leadership for putting together a package that really got their support.
Okay, let's talk about Amendment G, what it does. Define Amendment G for us.
Okay, so if you read Amendment G, it's possible really to kind of miss the nuance of it. Right now, education funding is limited, income tax collection is only limited to be spent on education. So if we bring in $1 billion in funding, that education has to be spent in education. And it ignored really, you know, that education is becoming much more to every student from a funding perspective. And so what we found ourselves doing was we looked at, well, maybe there are ways that we can narrowly open up the funding to be allowed for children and for people with special needs and handicaps and those kinds of things. Sorry, the language jumps out of my head right as we're talking. But it really allows us to spend, you know, income tax revenue on the whole student and acknowledging that, you know, from mental health services and those kinds of things that can be provided at the school level. And it also provides us the budget flexibility to provide long-term funding for student growth and for inflation.
Okay, so one of the criticisms was, okay, if you're going to take it from there, where do you get more for education? And one of the big concerns was in economic downturn, in a downturn, which at the time of the legislative session, we didn't really see what was coming necessarily. Well, we're in hard economic times right now. So how do you make up for that funding gap there?
Great question. You know, we talked about inflation, and we also talked about, so inflationary growth in the WPU. We also talked about not having to worry about funding student growth or student population growth. So those two parts of it are taken care of in House Bill 357. But a third component, really the third leg of the stool to shore up education funding, is the creation of a rainy day fund specifically for education during downturns to make sure that those specific items, i.e. inflationary growth and student growth, are for sure covered. And so in some ways, in the past, though there has been no growth in education funding during downturns, and we've seen loss or even stagnation really in that fund during the times we're in a downturn, this creation of the rainy day fund, that if the funding continues as it is this last year, that even during the COVID time, we would see 2 or 3 years before this fund could really make sure that student growth and inflationary spending would always be covered in education. And that was really, that fund, together with those other measures, is really what brought the education community to the table.
So are you certain that your colleagues up on the Hill and the governor will continue to put the type of focus on education funding that we have seen in the last few years? Well, as far as new money coming in.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question, because I think I hope the public recognizes and everyone recognizes that at the legislature, we have always funded. If you look at education as a percentage of our expenditures in the state, it has always been number one at the state level. And the second part of that is, when you look at our education spending as a percentage of our budget, we are always in the top 5 in the country for our spending a percentage of our budget on education. And I guess everybody says, well, we're still low on the WPU number. I understand that. But recognize the legislative priority is always to cover and make sure that we provide for the future, which is our education system.
So the bill, or the amendment passed by about 9 percentage points. It was one of 7 amendments on the ballot. That was the one I was kind of watching closely. At first, it's unusual to see amendments pass the way they did this year. But were you surprised at all by the percentage of the vote that this one passed by?
I wasn't surprised. I felt like Amendment G would pass, and I feel like the real reason it passed is because of the leadership of Representative Schultz and Senator Milner up north. And their efforts in working with the Utah Education Association, the PTA, and other education groups to really drive a compromise. I mean, when you see those groups put out a positive note, it was amazing. I'd heard from some of my more conservative-led constituents saying, wait a minute, I don't understand this. Why would they support this? And walking them through what they get and versus what they're giving up, it's going to be a good deal for Utah, and it will continue to be a good deal for Utah's future.
Okay, you alluded to this, but we do still sit in that dubious position of last in the nation when it comes to per pupil spending. Do you see us coming out of that anytime soon?
Well, we're really hoping that Idaho stops funding its students altogether, and that would really help bump us up to 49. I say that in jest, and I really probably shouldn't, but I think the hard part is we have a lot of kids in the state of Utah, and it is one of the reasons Utah's economic future is so bright. And having a lot of kids on a per capita basis makes us have to be spend thrifty and be smart about our education dollars. And I'm really grateful for our local superintendents and board members who keep it that way.
All right, Senator, we have run out of time. We appreciate your time on this Sunday to help walk us through this. Thanks so much for being here.